My family are suing me for the rights to my baby, for something they did, but they don't know what I have up my sleeve. I was 20 years old and 4 months pregnant when my family started trying to convince me to give my baby to my sister. She was the golden child, 32, married to a well-off lawyer, but most importantly, infertile. And the last thing she needed to complete her perfect image was a baby. They tried everything: manipulation, shady adoption papers, even gaslighted me asking if I really wanted to look into my baby's eyes and see my ex, who abused me. But it didn't work. I gave birth without them, held my baby in my arms, and for the first 10 months of his life, my family were ghosts, until it happened. My baby was diagnosed with autism. I told my family because I figured their baby crazy was over by now, but the second they heard it, they ramped it back up, and this time to an 11. My sister Sarah showed up at my studio apartment the next day with a stack of printed articles about autism therapy costs. She explained how necessary specialized care could run thousands per month, and because I was already barely scraping by, it was better to give her my baby. Not giving him this care is basically child abuse, she said with a smile. Before I could even respond, she told me she already had a sensory room set up in her house. She'd been taking mommy classes. She then pulled out framed certificates from her purse and lined them up on my kitchen counter. My mom started visiting daily too after months of silence. She'd hold my son while he stimmed, and one afternoon, I walked in from the bathroom and caught her holding him and pointing at Sarah's photo, saying mama over and over. This was just the start though. You see, I needed their help, and they knew it. I was working double shifts at the restaurant at the time just to afford my son's therapy, and had absolutely no money to pay for a babysitter. My family knew this, and my sister wasted no time exploiting it. On her first day of babysitting, Sarah cheerfully promised me she'd follow all my rules. She swore she respected me as his mother, but of course, I didn't exactly trust her, and so I stuck a nanny cam in his favorite teddy bear without telling her. For the first 3 weeks, everything was surprisingly fine, until one Wednesday when Sarah was supposed to be babysitting. I got a call from my building manager. She told me police were here, inquiring about an abandoned baby in my apartment. My stomach dropped. I raced home, and when I got there, I was met with 2 police officers trying to break my door down. They had me unlock the door, then put me in cuffs, and finally called the closest thing to a legal guardian, my sister, and asked her if she was free to come down and watch my baby for the rest of the day. During the whole ride to the station, they wouldn't even let me explain what was going on. It's only in the interrogation room that I convinced them to give me my phone so I could show them my nanny cam footage, which by the way, thank God for. I loaded it up, and there it was, my sister, the closest thing to a legal guardian, minding my baby before randomly just up and leaving for the next half an hour. The timestamp proved everything. I was let out, but the officers didn't even do anything to pursue Sarah. They just told me to watch out for her. Sadly, things only escalated from there. My family started documenting every meltdown my child had. They cited him crying during lighting as proof of me being abusive, cited him crying at sudden sounds on the TV as me being unattentive to his special needs. They even recorded me crying from exhaustion after a 16-hour shift and edited out the context. Their custody petition hit me like a physical blow. Sarah's husband, the lawyer, built a case claiming around the fact I'd abandoned my child, said I couldn't provide adequate care, and cited me as being mentally unstable. He'd included his wife's certificates, statements they'd gathered from my neighbors with quotes about my child crying taken out of context, and accumulated 47 pages of evidence. And then came the final blow. My ex walked into the courtroom. The same ex who threatened to beat our kid if I made him be a dad, the same ex who signed away his rights for $500, now stood there claiming he wanted what was best for our son. I honestly thought I was going to lose. My lawyer was the cheapest I could find, and I showed up to court looking a mess after a 16-hour shift. But then, my pediatrician saved us. She testified about my baby's progress. Not only that, under oath, she revealed that Sarah had called her office 47 times trying to get his medical records and threatened her if she didn't cave. I looked at her so thankful. And then, when I took the stand, I played the nanny cam recording, the same one I played the officers. But this time, authorities took me seriously. I saw my family's face dropping, like they were regretting this. And then came the beautiful moment. My neighbor took the stand. They testified that Sarah had offered money to lie about me. Then my ex went on stand, and under oath he cracked. He admitted they'd paid him to show up. The judge was horrified. She called this a coordinated attempt to steal a child and issued immediate restraining orders against my entire family. Sarah jumped up screaming that I was wasting him. Security had to drag them out while my mom sobbed about destroying our family. I thought it was finally over. I moved apartments and changed my phone number. But then 5 days later, I was installing new locks when the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find my entire family on the doorstep with my ex standing in front holding custody papers. Sarah stood behind him with her hand on his back, that same smile she wore when she thought she was winning. The custody papers in his hand were dated 3 weeks ago, which meant they'd filed them before the restraining order even existed. My hands trembled as I tried to comprehend their audacity in showing up like this after everything the judge had said. Sarah held up her phone and started recording while my ex shoved the papers toward me, claiming I was being aggressive and unstable, even though I hadn't moved from my doorway. The camera flash made me squint, and I realized she was taking photos too, while narrating that I appeared to be under the influence of something. I tried to close the door, but my mom wedged herself into the frame with surprising strength for a woman her age. Tears streamed down her face as she wailed about wanting to see her grandson one last time before she died, because the doctors had given her terrible news. That's when I noticed the medical bracelet on her wrist that definitely wasn't there during the court hearing just last week. The metal looked fresh and unscratched, like she'd just taken it out of its packaging that morning, and the hospital name on it was from a facility that had closed down 2 years ago. My baby started crying from his bedroom, and Sarah's entire demeanor shifted like a predator catching the scent of prey. She pushed past me with such force that I stumbled backward while claiming he needed his real mother to comfort him properly. My ex moved to block me from following her and used his larger frame to fill the hallway completely. His body shifted every time I tried to squeeze past him, like we were playing some twisted game of basketball where my son's safety was the ball. Sarah knew exactly which door led to his room, even though she'd supposedly never been to this new apartment before. She turned the handle with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it many times and disappeared inside while my mom kept filming everything. The sound of my son's confused and frightened cries grew louder as Sarah cooed at him in a sickly sweet voice that made my skin crawl. I heard her telling him that Mama was here now and everything would be okay, which made him cry harder because he didn't recognize her as his mother. When I finally managed to shove past my ex and reach the bedroom, Sarah had my baby in her arms and was swaying back and forth. She was whispering that his real mama was here to save him, while my mom filmed and narrated how I'd abandoned my child child to cry alone in his room like some kind of neglectful monster. The clothes my son wore weren't ones I'd bought him, and they still had tags attached like they'd been purchased just for this moment. My blood ran cold as I realized they'd been in my apartment before without my knowledge to plan this entire confrontation. I lunged for my phone to call 911, but my ex grabbed it from my hand and tossed it to Sarah's husband, who had suddenly appeared from my bathroom. He was holding photos of what he called my drug paraphernalia, which were actually just my prescription anxiety medications that any single mother would need. The bottle in the photos had a different label than my actual medication, with dosages that were triple what I'd been prescribed. They'd planted fake evidence during their previous break-in, and were now using it to build their case against me in real time. The commotion had attracted my neighbors, who started emerging from their apartments to see what was happening. Sarah immediately raised her voice and announced to everyone in the hallway that they were here to save the baby from his drug-addicted mother who left him alone to cry for hours. She waved the fake photos around, making sure everyone got a good look, while my mom added commentary about how she'd tried so hard to help me get clean. The same neighbor who had testified on my behalf at the custody hearing quickly retreated back inside her apartment, and I heard the deadbolt click into place. Sarah's husband started loudly reading from what he claimed was a social worker's report about my fitness as a mother. The report was completely fabricated, but he read it with such authority that my neighbors started whispering among themselves and shooting me disgusted looks. He mentioned track marks that didn't exist, and dealer visits that never happened, while painting a picture of a junkie mother who endangered her special needs child every single day. The police arrived within minutes, but my ex immediately took control of the situation by showing them the custody papers. He spoke in a calm and measured tone about their concerns for the baby's safety. While I struggled to form coherent sentences through my panic and rage, Sarah played edited videos on her phone that somehow showed me attacking them at the door, even though I knew that wasn't what had happened. The videos had been spliced together from multiple angles, which meant they'd had more than one person recording from the very beginning. The responding officer was the same one who hadn't pursued charges against Sarah before, and I watched his face harden as he looked at the evidence they presented. He barely glanced at the restraining order I managed to pull up on my laptop, and seemed annoyed that I was making his job complicated. Sarah's husband smoothly suggested that conflicting court orders meant they needed an emergency hearing to sort everything out properly for the child's well-being. My ex suddenly produced printed text messages that were supposedly from me talking about using drugs and being unable to care for my baby. The messages were complete fabrications, but they'd somehow spoofed my phone number to make them look legitimate to anyone who didn't understand technology. He showed these to the officer while shaking his head sadly about how he'd tried to help me get clean for our son's sake, but I'd refused all his attempts at intervention. The officer declared that both parties would need to appear at an emergency custody hearing the next day to resolve the conflict. Sarah smirked as he announced she would temporarily keep my baby due to the safety concerns raised by the drug paraphernalia and text messages they'd presented. She already had a car seat installed in her luxury SUV that looked like it had been purchased specifically for a child my son's age. The entire confrontation had been orchestrated to trigger exactly this outcome, and I realized they'd probably consulted with lawyers about how to manipulate the system. I watched helplessly as Sarah carried my screaming baby to her car while my mom pretended to comfort me. She whispered that this was for the best, and I should just let it happen peacefully if I really loved my son like I claimed. Her breath smelled like wine even though it was barely noon, and I wondered how long she'd been drinking to prepare herself for betraying her own daughter like this. My landlord was waiting when I returned to my apartment with an eviction notice in his hand. He explained that he couldn't have drug activity in his building, and several tenants had already complained about the disturbance today. Sarah's husband had clearly gotten to him first, because he wouldn't even let me explain that the whole thing was a setup. He gave me 3 days to vacate, which was probably illegal, but I didn't have money for a lawyer to fight it. I showed up to my restaurant job the next morning, desperate to earn money for legal representation. My manager met me at the door and told me not to bother clocking in because I'd been terminated effective immediately. He showed me printouts of social media posts about my drug problem that had over 500 shares from concerned citizens in our community. The timestamp on the original post showed it had been created 2 hours before yesterday's apartment confrontation, which proved they'd planned every aspect of this attack. Several of my coworkers avoided eye contact as I collected my final paycheck, which was barely enough to cover a cheap motel for a few nights. One of the younger servers whispered that Sarah had been in yesterday asking questions about my work schedule and whether I'd ever seemed impaired on the job. She'd planted seeds of doubt that bloomed into full suspicion once the social media posts started circulating among the staff. I drove to the pharmacy to refill my anxiety medication, but discovered my prescription had been canceled by my doctor. The pharmacist explained she'd received concerning information about drug-seeking behavior and couldn't help me anymore without a new evaluation. Security footage on the monitor behind her clearly showed Sarah's husband leaving the pharmacy just 30 minutes earlier, but she pretended not to notice when I pointed it out. Without my medication, the panic attacks would get worse, which would make me look even more unstable at tomorrow's hearing. My next stop was the legal aid office where I'd found my previous lawyer, but the receptionist informed me he'd withdrawn from my case. She said he'd cited a conflict of interest after Sarah's husband's firm had offered him a partnership position that would triple his salary. She whispered that 3 other lawyers in town had gotten similar offers that morning and suggested I might need to look for representation in another city. The nearest city was 2 hours away, and I didn't have gas money to get there and back. I spent the rest of the day calling every lawyer in the phone book, but they all claimed to have full caseloads or conflicts of interest. One secretary accidentally let slip that there was a memo going around about me before catching herself and hanging up. Sarah's husband had leveraged his firm's influence to blacklist me from getting any legal help, which left me completely defenseless for tomorrow's hearing. My ex started bombarding me with text messages that night demanding his child support payments back. He claimed I'd committed fraud by collecting money for a child I couldn't properly care for, and threatened to report me to the welfare office if I didn't sign over custody immediately. The messages included details about my food stamp application and other public assistance I received that I'd never told him about. Someone had given him access to my personal information, and he was weaponizing my poverty as another tool to break me down. I tried to sleep in my car that night, but kept getting woken up by police officers checking on me. Each officer had received a call about a suspicious person matching my description, possibly using drugs in a vehicle with a child present. Even though my baby wasn't with me, they had to investigate each call, which meant I spent the entire night being questioned and having flashlights shined in my face. By morning, I looked exactly like the drug addict Sarah had been telling everyone I was. The courthouse bathroom mirror showed me exactly how bad things had had gotten in just 48 hours. My eyes were bloodshot from crying and lack of sleep while my clothes were wrinkled from sleeping in the car. I tried to clean myself up with paper towels and hand soap, but there was only so much I could do without access to a shower or clean clothes. Sarah would show up looking perfectly put together while I looked like I'd been living on the streets, which technically I had been. I went to my pediatrician's office hoping she could write a statement about my fitness as a mother since she couldn't testify in person again. The receptionist informed me that Sarah was already there with my baby for an emergency appointment about neglect-related developmental delays. Through the small window to the waiting room, I could see my son wearing a medical alert bracelet he'd never needed before. Sarah was loudly discussing his regression since being in her care, but framing it as damage from my neglect rather than trauma from being separated from his mother. The pediatrician agreed to meet me secretly at a coffee shop after Sarah left, but her hands shook as she explained the situation. Sarah's husband had sent her practice 3 separate letters threatening malpractice suits if she involved herself in our custody dispute again. He'd researched every patient complaint from the last decade and promised to pursue each one aggressively if she testified. She had employees and their families depending on her practice surviving, which meant she couldn't risk helping me no matter how wrong she knew this was. I returned to the courthouse early, hoping to organize my thoughts before the hearing, but found Sarah already there with a team of lawyers. She was setting up poster boards with printed screenshots of the fake social media posts about my drug use and enlarged photos of the planted evidence from my apartment. Her husband directed the setup like a conductor organizing an orchestra, while my ex practiced his testimony about my supposed addiction with one of their junior lawyers. The stress made me physically ill, and I ran to the courthouse bathroom to vomit from anxiety. Sarah's friend was waiting in the next stall with her phone already recording when I entered. She started narrating about my drug withdrawal symptoms loud enough for everyone in the bathroom to hear while I retched into the toilet. Her visitor badge showed she was there specifically for family court, which meant she'd been stationed there just to catch me at my most vulnerable. I tried to compose myself, but the lack of medication made my hands shake uncontrollably as I washed my face. Sarah's friend made sure to capture that on video too, while commenting about how addicts always had the shakes when they couldn't get their fix. 2 other women in the bathroom quickly left while shooting me disgusted looks that made me feel like maybe I really was the monster Sarah had convinced everyone I was. Back in the courtroom, I had to represent myself against Sarah's team of 3 lawyers, since no one would take my case. They presented 72 hours worth of staged videos and manufactured documentation while I struggled to address each lie fast enough to keep up. The court clerk kept glancing at me with what looked like recognition and sympathy, but she remained silent as the judge reviewed the mountain of fabricated evidence. Every time I tried to explain something, they had 3 more pieces of evidence to contradict me. Sarah's husband presented a psychological evaluation that had supposedly been done on me by a professional who was concerned about my mental state. I'd never met the psychologist whose signature was on the report, but it included details about my life that only family would know. The evaluation painted me as someone with severe mental health issues, who self-medicated with illegal drugs, and posed a danger to my child's development. My ex testified about finding drug paraphernalia in my apartment during a visit that never happened. He broke down crying about how he'd tried to help me get clean for our son's sake, but I'd chosen drugs over motherhood every time. His performance was so convincing that even I almost believed it for a moment before remembering that he'd never even been to my new apartment before yesterday's ambush. The judge granted temporary custody to Sarah pending a full hearing in 2 weeks that we all knew would just be more of the same theater. I collapsed on the courthouse steps as my baby screamed while being carried away from me by someone he didn't recognize as family. A local news van pulled up just in time to catch my breakdown, and I heard the reporter mention something about covering the story of an unfit mother losing custody. By that evening, I was the lead story with my worst moment playing on repeat for the whole city to see. The eviction was already in process when I returned to collect my belongings from the apartment. The landlord had maintenance staff watching to make sure I only took what was mine while making comments about drug addicts destroying property values. I packed what I could fit into my car while they photographed every item I touched as evidence of something, though I wasn't sure what. My entire life fit into 3 garbage bags and a laundry basket, which seemed like its own kind of evidence of my failures. I spent that night in a bus shelter downtown watching the news story about me play on the TV in a nearby store window. The news anchor, who was married to someone from Sarah's mommy group, added her own commentary about how some people just weren't meant to be mothers, no matter how many chances they got. They showed my breakdown on repeat while discussing the epidemic of drug-addicted parents losing custody of their special needs children. My photo was plastered across the screen with the word unfit underneath in bold red letters. The public library became my refuge during the day where I could use their computers to research my options. That's when I discovered Sarah's mommy blog called Saving My Nephew that documented her journey to rescue a special needs child from an unfit mother. The blog had started 6 months ago, which was before my son was even diagnosed with autism, which meant she'd been planning this for longer than I'd imagined. She'd posted photos of his nursery taken from inside my old apartment during times when I'd trusted her to babysit. Reading through the blog posts made me physically sick as I realized how calculated everything had been from the start. She'd documented every interaction with me, but twisted the narrative to make herself look like a savior. The comments section was full of supportive messages from other moms praising her dedication to protecting an innocent child. Some of them mentioned donating to her legal fund, which meant she was actually profiting from stealing my baby. I managed to get a meeting with a social worker who reviewed custody disputes, but she seemed to already know about my case. She kept referring to the documentation that had been submitted about my drug use and mental health issues while barely listening to my explanations. When I mentioned the blog showing premeditation, she dismissed it as a concerned aunt trying to help, which wasn't illegal. The system that was supposed to protect families had been turned into a weapon against me. My car broke down outside the welfare office where I was trying to apply for emergency assistance. The tow truck driver mentioned that someone had called about an abandoned vehicle with drug paraphernalia visible inside, even though my car only contained clothes and blankets. He had to search the vehicle before towing it, which meant dumping all my belongings on the sidewalk while people walked by staring. Sarah's reach extended even to random tow truck drivers who'd been primed to see me as a criminal. I found temporary shelter at a women's crisis center, but discovered Sarah volunteered there twice a week. The intake coordinator mentioned she was their most dedicated volunteer who specialized in helping mothers in crisis, which made everyone admire her even more. I had to lie about my name and situation to avoid detection while sleeping in the same building where she was treated like a saint. The intake form asked about custody disputes, and someone Someone had already penciled liar next to that question on every form. Sarah's influence at the shelter meant I had to follow strict rules that didn't apply to other residents. I was drug tested daily, even though I'd never used drugs, while other women with actual addiction issues weren't monitored as closely. The staff watched me constantly and made notes about every interaction I had with other residents. One woman whispered that Sarah had warned them about a dangerous person who might try to stay there, and described someone who looked exactly like me. I stole a phone from the donation bin to check my baby's daycare portal since mine had been shut off for non-payment. The portal showed he'd been withdrawn from the program entirely, with a note about behavioral issues that required more intensive support than they could provide. Sarah was homeschooling him now, which meant no mandated reporters would see signs of neglect or abuse. The last note from his teacher mentioned increasing meltdowns and developmental regression that hadn't been present before the separation. My food stamp card stopped working at the grocery store, and the clerk said it had been flagged for suspicious activity. Someone had reported that I was selling my benefits for drug money, which triggered an investigation and immediate suspension. Without food assistance, I had to rely on soup kitchens where Sarah's friends volunteered and recognized me immediately. They would serve everyone else first and give me the smallest portions while making comments about tax dollars supporting addicts. My ex found me at a food bank where I was waiting in line for a box of groceries. He offered me $1,000 cash to sign custody papers giving up all rights to our son permanently. The bills had sequential serial numbers, which meant they were marked and would be evidence of selling my child if I took them. He dropped the shoplifting charges as a show of good faith while reminding me that nobody would believe a homeless drug addict in court anyway. The other people in line started whispering about someone selling their baby and moved away from me like I was contagious. That night I couldn't take anymore and swallowed every pill I could find in the shelter's medicine cabinet. They weren't enough to kill me, but made me sick enough that someone called an ambulance, and I woke up in the hospital with my stomach being pumped. Sarah arrived within an hour as my emergency contact since I'd listed her months ago when I still trusted her. She stood at the foot of my bed documenting my mental instability for the court while I was still groggy and disoriented from the medication they'd given me. The psychiatrist assigned to evaluate me was married to one of Sarah's husband's law partners, which I only discovered when I saw their wedding photo on his desk. He'd already written his notes before our interview even began, with conclusions about my fitness as a mother and recommendations for extended inpatient treatment. The mental health system designed to help people in crisis was being weaponized against me to permanently disqualify me from custody. He prescribed heavy antipsychotics that would make me seem drugged at any future court appearances. During my 72-hour hold, a court-appointed advocate visited to check on my welfare, but seemed more interested in gathering information. She quietly mentioned that my baby had been hospitalized for a head injury that Sarah claimed happened during an autism-related episode. The bruising pattern suggested something else, but the advocate said she couldn't officially report suspicions without proof. She whispered that violating protocol to help me would cost her the job she needed to support her own children, and I understood she was trapped in the system just like me. My mom visited me in the hospital chapel where I'd gone to pray or think or just exist somewhere quiet. She begged me to sign the papers giving Sarah permanent custody because things were getting worse at home. Her arms had fresh scratches that looked like defensive wounds, and her voice shook as she admitted Sarah was getting frustrated with my baby's needs. She said accidents happen when people are pushed too far, and maybe it would be better for everyone if I just let go. Even while seeing the truth, she maintained loyalty to her golden child over her grandson's safety. The discharge nurse whispered that Sarah had called every day asking about my condition and when I might be permanently committed. She seemed disappointed each time she heard I was improving, and had even suggested they were releasing me too soon. The nurse said she'd seen this before with family members trying to use psychiatric holds to win custody battles, but there was nothing she could do except warn me. She slipped me a bus pass and $20 that she said was from a charity fund, but I knew came from her own pocket. They released me after 72 hours, but I'd been marked as a failure to appear for 3 custody hearings that had happened while I was hospitalized. The court system had proceeded without me, and each missed appearance was counted as evidence that I'd abandoned my child. Sarah's lawyers had successfully argued that my suicide attempt proved I was an unfit mother who chose self-harm over fighting for her son. The final custody hearing was scheduled for the next day, and I had no lawyer and no evidence to counter their narrative. I arrived at the courthouse in the same hospital clothes I'd been discharged in since I had nothing else to wear. Security immediately alerted Sarah, who was already there with her legal team, and she smirked while texting someone. The guard who received the text suddenly decided I needed an enhanced search and made a big show of checking me for weapons or drugs, while other people entering the courthouse walked through without issue. Even courthouse security had been compromised by her influence. While waiting outside the courtroom, my ex's new girlfriend approached me nervously. She looked around before showing me text messages from Sarah asking her to buy more baby sleep aid than any toddler should need. Sarah had been drugging my baby with adult doses of melatonin to keep him quiet and manageable since she couldn't handle his actual needs. The girlfriend said she'd thought it was weird but hadn't realized how dangerous it was until she looked up the dosage online. She was scared but willing to testify if it would help protect the baby. The judge called us into chambers for a private meeting before the formal hearing where Sarah's husband argued that my suicide attempt proved I was dangerously unstable. I had no lawyer to counter his arguments while he painted a picture of a mentally ill drug addict who would rather die than care for her child. The judge's desk had a photo from a charity golf tournament where he stood smiling next to Sarah's husband and several other lawyers from his firm. The connection was subtle but clear, and I knew this private meeting was just theater before the predetermined outcome. Back in the main courtroom, Sarah held my baby as he started having a severe meltdown from overstimulation. Instead of using any of the calming techniques I'd taught her during those early babysitting days, she violently shook him while yelling at him to stop crying. The entire courtroom watched in shocked silence as she completely lost control and showed her true nature under pressure. The court reporter stopped typing and froze with her hands above the keys, while the bailiff took a step forward before hesitating. During the chaos, the ex's girlfriend stood up and announced she had evidence of Sarah drugging the baby. The judge had to call a recess while Sarah screamed that the girlfriend was lying and just jealous. In the hallway, Sarah cornered me in the bathroom and grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises. She hissed that I'd better make the girlfriend recant or she'd make sure my baby suffered for it. Her perfect makeup was smeared and I could see scratch marks on her neck where my son had clearly fought back against her rough handling. When we returned to the courtroom, my former neighbor who had retreated into her apartment that day burst through the doors with a laptop. She'd been feeling guilty about not helping and had reviewed her doorbell camera footage from the past few months. The footage showed Sarah breaking into my old apartment multiple times to plant evidence and take photos for her blog. The timestamp on one break-in was the night before the first CPS report, which proved this had been planned from the beginning. The judge ordered immediate custody return, but Sarah refused to hand over my baby. She screamed that I would kill him like I'd tried to kill myself while clutching him so tightly that he cried out in pain. The bailiff hesitated to physically take a baby from such a well-dressed, respectable woman, while everyone in the courtroom held their breath. Sarah's husband tried to calm her, but she turned on him too and accused him of not doing enough to secure their son. Sarah tried to run with my baby, but the bailiff finally moved to stop her. She fought against him with surprising strength while my baby screamed in terror at being caught in the middle of a physical struggle. During the chaos, Sarah fell hard with her head hitting the corner of the defense table with a sickening crack that echoed through the courtroom. My baby crawled to me as Sarah lay unconscious and bleeding on the floor, while her phone showed drafted messages about fleeing the state with her son. The emergency room was chaos as they rushed Sarah in for surgery, while her husband screamed that I'd murdered her. He kept telling anyone who would listen that I'd pushed her even though dozens of witnesses had seen her fall while fighting the bailiff. Doctors worked frantically to reduce the swelling in her brain while I sat in a small room giving my statement to police for the 5th time. My baby clung to me and wouldn't let go even when the nurses tried to examine him for injuries. My mom finally broke down and admitted everything to the police. She pulled out her phone and showed them recordings she'd made secretly where Sarah threatened to have her committed to a nursing home if she didn't cooperate. The recordings included Sarah saying she'd rather see my baby dead than let me raise him and outlined the entire plan from the beginning. Mom had been collecting evidence just in case but had been too scared to use it until now when faced with the reality of what her compliance had enabled. My ex cracked under police questioning and admitted Sarah had promised him $50,000 to play along with her scheme. He showed bank transfers from her husband's firm disguised as consulting fees that corresponded with every court appearance and false statement he'd made. The money trail exposed the entire conspiracy and showed how they'd weaponized the legal system against a young mother with no resources. He seemed relieved to finally tell the truth and mentioned he'd been having nightmares about what they were doing. Sarah died from a brain hemorrhage 4 hours after the fall while I was giving my baby his seizure medication in the pediatric ward. Her husband immediately had me served with wrongful death lawsuit papers that were dated from the day before, which meant he'd prepared them in advance. Even in his grief, he was continuing the legal warfare using the same tactics they'd always employed. The process server seemed uncomfortable delivering papers to someone holding a baby in a hospital room, but did his job anyway. The district attorney reviewed all the evidence and announced criminal charges against Sarah's husband and several family members for conspiracy and attempted kidnapping. She mentioned this was the first case she'd seen where the primary perpetrator died while committing the crime, but that wouldn't stop prosecution of the others involved. The press conference was packed with reporters who'd been following the story since my courthouse breakdown, and public opinion was starting to shift as the truth emerged. I packed everything we owned into a small rental truck while reporters camped outside trying to get an exclusive interview. My mom stood on the sidewalk begging for forgiveness and promising she'd testify against everyone involved if I'd just let her back in our lives. I couldn't trust her after everything she'd done and enabled, so I drove away without looking back. The moving truck was already loaded because I'd learned to act fast and never give them time to plan their next attack. At the airport, Sarah's husband made one last desperate attempt by showing up at our gate with an emergency custody order. Airport police quickly verified it was forged and arrested him on the spot for fraud and violating his bail conditions. My baby played calmly with his sensory toy and didn't even recognize the man who had spent months trying to steal him. The other passengers whispered and pointed as they led him away in handcuffs while he screamed about justice for his wife. 6 months have passed since that horrible day in court, and our lives have completely transformed. I work as an advocate for parents facing custody battles and help them recognize the warning signs of systematic harassment that I missed until almost too late. My son is thriving with proper therapy and support from professionals who actually understand autism, instead of seeing it as something to hide or drug away. Sarah's husband is serving 5 years for conspiracy and fraud, while my mother got probation in exchange for her testimony.